Great. I'm so thrilled to see so many of you on tonight's call, and I know many more will be watching the recording at a later stage. I assume many of you here tonight are deeply involved in or have a strong interest in either climate activism, just transition work, or policy making. I also assume many of you in the past few years, maybe even in the past decades, have been frustrated by the lack of government action on climate change. Well, I have found Dr. Terence Loomis' report incredibly helpful in thinking about what our role as engaged citizens can be in supporting the government to accelerate their efforts to transition to renewables. To briefly introduce 350 Aotearoa and our intention for bringing together this webinar. 350 Aotearoa is the New Zealand arm of the international climate movement 350.org, which aims to unite the world around climate change solutions. Our mission is to strengthen and grow climate action in communities across Aotearoa. We do that by coordinating local and national campaigns, by providing education, practical tools, and support for community leadership. Our campaigns allow individuals across the country to take part in collective action and stand up to the fossil fuel industry to end up all coal, oil and gas projects in New Zealand and call for a just transition to renewable energy. I look forward to sharing more about our new homegrown energy campaign at the end of this call, because with this campaign, we are going to start challenging New Zealand's reliance on fossil fuel electricity generation and demand from the government to invest in affordable, clean energy and introduce policies that will strengthen energy sovereignty. For this endeavour, a solid understanding of the obstacles governments are currently facing to accelerate the energy transition is fundamental. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to the wonderful Dr. Terence Loomis. Dr. Terence Loomis is an economic anthropologist and independent researcher. He has over 15 years of research and development consulting experience in the US, Canada, Australia, the Pacific, and New Zealand. Dr. Loomis was a professor of development studies in the School of Maori and Pacific Development at Waikato University, and has also spent over a decade as a senior policy analyst for the New Zealand government. Terence, I'm going to start sharing your presentation now, and then the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much, Alana. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm going to move relatively quickly through this because we've been talking about how much time it's going to take and also the need for discussion. So let me begin by saying that some of you will be familiar with the work of climate futurist Alex Steppen. In one of his recent blogs, he reflected on the devastating California wildfires and other extreme climate events, pointing out that none of these events are normal. People are gradually waking up to the fact that normal is gone. And he suggests that we're living in what Alex calls a trans-apocalyptic epoch of extreme discontinuity, where everything is in upheaval. My take on this is that on the one hand, people are becoming more anxious, even angry. They're expecting governments to control the fires, floods, droughts, and even compensate them for the damage. At the same time, surveys tell us that more and more people are seeing climate change as a serious problem. A few, mostly scientists, some young people, and even a few of us oldies do get the connection between corporate activities, our own lifestyles, and the worsening climate impacts that we're experiencing. Others are worried that if governments do take bold action to try to mitigate the climate emissions in particular, and even if they don't, there could be drastic changes to their lives and to their livelihoods. and they're not happy about it. So on reflection, politicians seem to be damned by history, and if they don't act, and damned by climate deniers, or perhaps by being sued by oil companies under the International Energy Charter Treaty, if they do take bold action. Few seem ready to lead in enacting the radical measures, or at least leading the enactment of radical measures that are necessary for planetary survival. Now, some might argue that the New Zealand government is taking climate change very seriously. I mean, we've got the Zero Carbon Act, which is across multi-party consensus or agreement, establishment of the Climate Change Commission. There was the PM's Climate Emergency Declaration, establishment of the Clean Car Rebate, research and development funding has been boosted. And recently, the Ministry for the Environment's work on emissions reduction plan, which has been circulated recently, all sorts of initiatives, too many to list. So the question then becomes, is New Zealand, like other countries, really engaged in emergency mode, particularly when it comes to energy system transformation, much less phasing out fossil fuels? Well, for one thing, New Zealand's emissions certainly are not declining. They plateaued for several years. That may be the good news. Carbon Tracker says recently that our current accounting system, which relies on offsets, could allow net emissions even to increase. And I certainly don't see much urgency in the government's low cap on ETS carbon unit price rises, or nor do I see much urgency in IMBY's so far 4-year work stream, which Minister Megan Woods recently rebranded misleadingly as a renewable energy strategy. I say misleadingly because, among other things, it contemplates changes to the Gas Act to stimulate the market to attract more gas infrastructure investment, ostensibly in the name of energy security. But interestingly, 45% of our gas actually goes to Methanex. It also includes a 10-year resources strategy, which the minister rushed through and has been already finalized, in which the minister rejected submissions from a number of groups to include a phase-out plan for fossil fuels. By the way, a recommendation the Climate Commission also made. Well, at least it's now mentioned in the Ministry for the Environment's emissions reduction plan discussion document, and understand that there will now be 4.5 billion in the upcoming next budget for implementation. But the process being followed suggests that it could take several years before government actually has an energy strategy to implement. So, question, a climate emergency? Well, in fairness, no country appears to be, I suggest, in climate emergency mode, certainly not compared to, say, World War mobilization or even pandemic mobilization. Some critics blame government's relative inertia or a failure of collective political will. But what on earth does that mean? And if it's a thing, what are the obstacles to politicians developing collective will to act urgently? Well, to just briefly give you an idea of where I'm going to go with this presentation, I'm probably going to disappoint some of you right away, because this report of ours doesn't propose new energy policies. Instead, what we investigated in our literature review and research was the obstacles that government politicians encounter in the process of developing a cohesive will to undertake bold actions like accelerated energy transition, obstacles which could also be relevant to cross-party consensus building. The report also discusses strategies that might help overcome some of these obstacles, and I'll try to mention these briefly toward the end. Let me say a brief word about energy system transition. It's undoubtedly a critical aspect of addressing the climate crisis. The IPCC addressed the issue of what is an energy system by defining it as the components and processes related to the production, delivery, and use of energy, including all of the energy resources that were used and energy markets. Energy transition in the context of climate change refers to then the process of replacing energy system which generates high greenhouse gas emissions with one that uses energy sources and technologies that generate low or zero emissions. But why the urgencies to accelerate energy transition? The emissions reduction commitments, and many of you are familiar with this, that countries made in Paris and as recently as COP26 in Glasgow, are still likely, according to analysts, to result in at least 2.4 degrees warming by the end of the century, meaning more extreme weather events, sea level rise, deaths, possible disruption, societal breakdown by climate refugees, somewhat sparked by them. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has called our current path catastrophic. Just one statistic, last year, 86% of global emissions came from the energy sector, mostly from producing and burning fossil fuels. So what's government's role then in energy transition, speaking broadly? Historically, energy transitions have usually occurred in gradual stages, but the record is actually mixed. A few transitions have been revolutionary. The World Economic Forum noted the benefits of rapid energy transition in a 2019 report. And the IEA, International Energy Agency, in its controversial net zero by 2050 roadmap, maintains that the global economy could be substantially decarbonized within 30 years, but emphasizes that governments have a critical leadership role to play. Research on rapid transitions has identified three factors that they seem to have in common, focusing now on the rapid transitions. Adoption of new technologies tends to trigger disruptions in ways of doing things, not just in energy, but right across multiple levels of society. Secondly, rapid transition is expedited by strong political leadership. And third, government investment in the early stages can kickstart rapid development and adoption of alternative technologies. Let's turn to this business of political will. Critics often blame things like self-interest, party politics, or failure of political will for government inertia in energy transition. It's amazing when you look through the literature and publications, even the media, how often you see that phrase used. But I suggest, and I'm not alone in this, that it's just lazy analysis. Political will is not some kind of black box process where in goes the aspirations, something mysterious happens, and out comes a new policy or a failed policy. It's actually a deliberate social construct. As Mark Funkhauser, who's professor of public administration at Tulane University, and by the way, himself an ex-mayor, puts it, every positive advance of public policy depends on its successful creation. That's political will. It's the outcome of political contestation, negotiation, and collaboration within the broader policymaking process. So what is political will? Well, it's not been well researched, but analysis by Laurie Post and her colleagues at the University of Colorado suggests that political will has four components. There's the extent of committed support among key decision makers for a particular policy solution to a particular agreed analysis of the problem. And our report examines these components in some detail, but I won't go into those. The basic point is that gaining a better understanding of what political will is and how the key components develop or are obstructed is crucial in explaining why governments have been slow to accelerate energy transition and how progressive political leaders in particular and collaborators, mutually concerned leaders in other sectors might overcome policy inertia. So let's talk about obstacles to developing political will. A review of the literature suggests that policymakers commonly face three kinds of obstacles when attempting to build and develop a cohesive political will, particularly to take on a transformative policy initiative. And those fall under broad headings of economic, contextual or structural, and political. There's nothing particularly surprising about these, but each has certain manifestations that affect the various building blocks of political will. And I'll touch on those aspects under these headings. So let's take economic obstacles to start with. First, and probably the most obvious and important, is ideological lock-in. Experience shows that limitless growth and resource consumption are inimical or contrary to planetary protection and human survival. When a significant number of the nation's politicians and bureaucrats remain trapped in such an outmoded framework, a paradigm, and or are dismissive of alternative paradigms, then it becomes virtually impossible to reach a consensus on rapid energy transformation, for example, because of the broad society-wide and ecological ramifications of that issue, of that crisis. And yet, at the same time, the experience of countries who have opted for market solutions as a prime focus and green growth, that record suggests that it's unlikely to be the answer. Then there's rent-seeking behavior. Rent-seeking behavior, of course, in economics is when an individual or corporate entity attempts to gain additional wealth by influencing the distribution of resources in their favor without contributing to productivity or to building new wealth. But rent-seeking is not just an economic behavior, it can take political form. For example, political maneuvering and obstructionism by individual politicians or factions within government, by which they put their own political interests or those of powerful groups that they depend on for their support ahead of the majority view that's emerging regarding a policy problem and the option which promises the best societal outcome. And then finally, another aspect of economic obstacles, the fallacy that urgent climate action will be too costly and disruptive. Politicians have fallen for the arguments of vested interests about the costs of mitigation and rapid energy transition. And investigations suggest that some consultant economists have been complicit in this deception. Numerous studies, some of which we cite in the report, suggest that a swifter, well-managed transition can reduce emissions more quickly and produce more positive outcomes and other benefits, particularly when the costs of extreme weather events, sea level rise, impacts on human health, forced migration, and species extinction are taken into account. Then what about the category of obstacle called, which we call the contextual or structural obstacles? One is referred to in the literature as carbon lock-in within the political economic system. This has to do with the embeddedness of the fossil fuels regime within the country's political economy and its sheer wealth and influence, which can lead to unquestioning acceptance of the industry's position or its evidence presented, and a reluctance by politicians to act against such interests. Their position in the economy and dependence on their products are simply taken for granted. Secondly, the influence of the fossil fuels industry over key institutions and what recent research has called energy cultures, particular institutional configuration of a country's public, commercial, and civil sectors, and each country is slightly different, is guided by certain values and codes about how these institutions interact with one another and how they shape national policies. These can be skewed through public relations campaigns, lobbying, legal challenges, influence peddling in favor of those powerful industries like fossil fuels. Also, research, which was New Zealand led, by the way, suggests that the fossil fuel industry's propaganda has played an important role in encouraging and legitimating energy cultures like climate change skepticism, which in turn has created a barrier to government efforts to accelerate energy transition. And then finally, under this sort of obstacle, something which we called outmoded or opaque policymaking governance and or procedures. Some of this will sound familiar to New Zealanders. Existing government arrangements and prevailing policymaking processes can restrict the ability of governments to implement bold energy transition measures. In some jurisdictions, these structures and processes have become overly top-down, bureaucratic, or fragmented into specialist silos, making it ill-suited for dealing with complex developing crises like climate change. But an interesting note, recently, Minister for Climate Change, James Shaw, lest you think we're beyond all that here, recently labeled the commitment and performance of government departments and possibly ministers to supposedly all of government climate planning. He labeled it as, in his word, lumpy. At any rate, moving on to the final set of obstacles. The political obstacle, overriding self-interest on the part of governing politicians is probably self-explanatory, and I won't go into that in more detail. Secondly, and one that I spent some time researching, as have many others, the active resistance of the fossil fuels industry. We know that energy incumbents are fighting to maintain the current carbon-based energy system for as long as possible, to at least reap the most profits out of the existing reserves and infrastructure they have in place. Industry spokespersons claim that there's no need to urgently phase out fossil fuels because of technologies like carbon capture and storage, which can sequester their CO2 emissions and make their operations reasonably clean. But critics say it is that kind of technology, particularly direct air CCS, is still too experimental and costly. The industry's main strategy has been predatory delay, which I documented for New Zealand in my recent book on the predatory delay diaries. And then finally, under this objective or obstacle, the potential for popular backlash. The multi-party democracies have the requirement for a mandate for government action, and it becomes broader the more urgent and far-reaching the issue. If the energy incumbency can raise doubt about the feasibility or the cost of rapid transition, its effects on people and businesses, it could be enough to spark self-interested public resistance and block political consensus on accelerating transition. Let's talk briefly about then overcoming obstacles to political will. By examining the research on obstacles against the key components of political will, it's possible to tease out some strategies from other research that policymakers and supporters could use to address some of these obstacles. In terms of economic obstacles, as I noted before, fixation on growth and GDP in a resource-constrained world is a major impediment to governments taking strong action on climate change. But rather than wasting time debating the failings of an outmoded neoclassical paradigm, progressive policymakers could work with like-minded colleagues, Treasury officials, ecological economists to formulate and secure widespread buy-in for a more holistic, sustainable policy framework, like New Zealand's experimenting with the well-being framework, or Kate Raworth's donut economics, or the whole degrowth movement. Next, most policymakers are aware of the potential for rent-seeking behavior by political colleagues or vested interests when it comes to major policy issues. Astute policymakers, I think we can skip on to the next slide. Yes, thank you. In terms of addressing rent-seeking behavior, that can be addressed through astute policymakers and advisors designing the organization of the policy team, the comms strategy, even setting out the specific policy process to be followed that could take account of some of the possibilities for rent seeking. And then, as noted, government needs to establish a popular mandate for urgent climate action. As with the pandemic, their efforts can be hindered by a lack of community awareness about the science behind the proposed policy, by misinformation campaigns. I suggest, and the research backs this up, that government leaders and policy advisors and academics working on different aspects of this have an important educational role and even a mobilization role to play. Would say somewhat parenthetically, they might even collaborate together in providing science-based evidence about climate change, challenging entrenched individual and corporate mindsets, and encouraging new lifestyles and collective action. Then if we turn to the structural obstacles, despite fossil fuel political economic lock-in, some governments have introduced measures to reduce fossil fuel industry subsidies, for example, and begin phasing out production. But at the same time, past experience suggests that in the energy transition, small innovative disruptions to the conventional system of energy in early stages of transition does provide opportunities to support technical innovators. Policymakers and advisors could, as a strategy, introduce what some authors called turnkey policy initiatives and monitor the ripple effects of these. For example, here in New Zealand, we have a number of community-based renewable energy projects that are underway, and this might be something to be taken on as a sort of demonstration. But at the same time, policymakers and their advisors need an in-depth understanding and an up-to-date understanding of the energy system, the key players, which subsectors are most receptive to adopting renewable technologies. In other words, where the most productive changes are likely to happen more quickly. Furthermore, some governments are adapting their climate governance and policy processes to achieve wider private and civil sector engagement in developing stronger climate measures. And that suggests that education campaigns of groups and government could shift beyond simply awareness raising to actively combating misinformation and enlightening resistance from energy cultures, for example, in the process of consultation. And then finally, talking about political obstacles to building a cohesive political will. Under normal circumstances, politicians have strong incentives to maintain the status quo and protect dominant sectors of the economy from undue disruption. The policymakers who recognize the need for accelerating energy transition, which itself could be disruptive, could create what some have called back-channel transpartisan coalitions of like-minded business people, academics, community leaders, climate activists, to respond to the activities of transition delaying coalitions and maneuver around obstructionists even within political parties. As we've seen, studies suggest that fossil fuels industry is one of the key obstacles to rapid transition. Given the urgency of transforming the system, progressive policymakers could consider establishing a collaborative network of policy advisors, academics, community-based groups who could research and share information about evolving strategies of particularly the fossil fuel incumbency. This research is going on at various times, certainly within some disciplines more than others, but that's a divergence I won't get off on at the moment, and how these are affecting efforts within government to build a cohesive will. And furthermore, progressive policymakers and advisors could monitor the effects and unofficially encourage the efforts of climate movements, union campaigns, community resilience projects, who themselves are attempting to raise public awareness and challenge the power of the fossil fuels regime and support transformative government initiatives. Well, to sum up, given the worsening of the climate crisis, there's clearly a need to draw lessons from research and experience about why governments have failed to develop a cohesive political will or cross-party consensus to pursue urgent energy transition. Apart from self-interest or bickering among political parties, the literature suggests that there are at least 3 of those sorts of obstacles that we have discussed from the research. It also suggests a range of strategies that politicians and their collaborators, and I use that because I'm talking about inside and outside government, I use that term advisedly, could adopt to overcome these obstacles. Some of the informal, behind-the-scenes options might be of particular interest to environmental and climate activist groups, although there are, I'm aware, some risks in engaging in those sorts of collaborations. Of course, the final point I would make is observing that many commentators point out that addressing the climate crisis is not just a matter of policy or technology, but will require ultimately fundamental economic and societal transformation or ways of living and doing things. Achieving widespread support for new behavioral norms, radical structural changes will be an enormous task and will inevitably have to come from the bottom up. No reira tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Terry. Over the past 2 months, I think I've read your report twice, and I've still just learned something from the presentation. So thank you so much for that. As I said before, we're going over to our question and answer part of the webinar now. I see we've already got our first question in the chat. Others feel free to put your questions in there as well. We've got approximately 10 minutes for questions, and as mentioned, you are encouraged to either put them in the chat or raise your Zoom hand. And then I can pass over a virtual microphone to you and invite you to unmute yourself. If you're unsure how to raise your hand, my colleague Alana is just going to put some instructions on how to do that in the chat. Dr. Loomis, I've got the first question for you. For those of people on the webinar who weren't lucky enough to receive a copy of your report in advance, where would they be able to find one?
I think there's two ways of doing it. You can just hop on to my website. So I've been coordinating fossil fuels Aotearoa Research Network. Hop onto my website, and there are a couple of ways of accessing a report, either downloading or opting by getting a solid report.
Great, thank you. And we'll include the link to Terry's website tomorrow in an email that's going out, including the recording if you want to go back and watch it. Now we've got some questions in the chat, and I'll just read them out as I can't see anyone raising their hand yet. Oliver is asking, in New Zealand, the COVID-19 pandemic response was probably the first time ever that scientific expert advice trumped ideology and entrenched political playbooks. Maybe because it was new and needed an urgent response, so there was an opportunity to do things differently. How can this successful precedent be copied and pasted and used to tackle the climate emergency?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It was what I was, in a rather clumsy way, hinting at, obviously because I had to abbreviate the presentation, but the report goes into a little more depth. Just a bit of a quick background. The FARN itself, Fossil Fuels Research Network, started actually 4 years ago in New Plymouth at a protest meeting and a citizens gathering, protesting the oil and gas industry in their annual meeting. It became obvious, and I did a presentation and then discussed with others, it became obvious that among a lot of the local community groups, a couple of organizations, organized climate groups, but also local community activist groups, climate justice, Taranaki, etc. There was a frustration about not being able to get access to academics, for example, or to research. There was a lot of groping around, and some people found some really good research, but in terms of getting it all together and comparing notes and finding a common ground for some of the research finding and getting access to it, and then asking what could we do about it. It was really difficult to overcome that kind of link gap between grassroots folks and academics. I mean, I made a comment earlier during my presentation, and I won't name my own discipline among others, but quite frankly, if you start looking around for academics that are actively engaged, there are a few young scholars coming through who are now taking up the challenge. But in terms of the establishment of academia, there haven't been that many. So I guess what I was trying to hint at in suggesting sort of a clandestine networking behind the scenes by progressive policymakers, advisors, and people in Wellington who are lobbyists for climate activism and so on will know who these people are and already network with them, and academics who happen to be committed to this kind of research, to try to build a more organized, I guess, I hate that word, but a more structured, intentional network of people rather than the ad hocery. And I hear the questioner sort of hinting that, for me, that's the sort of thing that would actually help pull together some of this science-based evidence, make sense of it, and get it out in palatable, intelligible forms to Joe Blogs in the street.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from Jack. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi there, thanks for that useful summary about the policy objectives and some ways of dealing with them. The question I have has to do with, well, it relates to the problem definition. If climate change is viewed as one symptom of a more fundamental problem, which could be defined as ecological overshoot, and therefore connects with biodiversity loss and inequality and pollution and a whole range of other ecological and social challenges that we face. Obviously, the scale of transformation required is beyond simply an energy one, not only in technical terms, but also in social and behavioral terms, because it affects so many aspects of society. Economic system, how we define money, how we create money, and so on. Do you think that the summary that you've provided for an energy transition in itself would also be applicable to the broader sort of transformation that some of us believe is required?
I think my first reaction, and I think I was trying to hint at that, Jack, toward the end of my presentation. In fact, I noticed somebody in the chat had commented about the need for nonviolent protest, so on. I think some of the strategies that I was suggesting are really, I don't know how you would put it, in terms of structural change, would have to do with internal transformation of our ways of doing things politically in terms of decision making. I think it could potentially build a foment for different ways of talking to one another and acting across the various sectors. So to that extent, it could, the way we're approaching this and the possible building of a fire, if you will, to progress energy transition could be a way of a catalyst for a different way of thinking. But I think that's about as far as I'd want to take that. It may be, it may not be. On the other hand, I suspect, and I guess the reason for that is that, well, as you look at downtown Wellington at the moment and throughout the country, I've sometimes said sort of quietly to a few people that if you think reaction to mandates for wearing masks is going to get people riled up, wait till we start getting bold propositions for transforming our energy system. For example, allowing the price of emissions trading carbon units to just float freely. I mean, you'll know yourself that I don't know what the research says about and what IPCC and so on have said about the possible level that a unit would have to rise to really get people thinking about changes and radical transformations in their lives. But it's certainly a lot higher than the price of petrol right now, that I can tell you. So maybe that combination of internal different ways of doing things and reaction to bold government steps might be a catalyst to thinking outside the norm.
Great, thank you. I feel like you've answered 2 questions with that, so I might skip Robin's question. Another question from Marcus. You mentioned governments potentially being sued by big oil. Can that really happen? Can governments use their just say no card?
I'm not an expert in international law, but I do know that there's an international convention, a treaty that does allow companies to lodge claims against governments for action detrimental to the best interests of those companies. And I think it has been used. It's certainly been used. Jack will probably be aware of this. I think in California, it has been used in the courts. Of course, that's domestic, but that same kind of court action. So yeah, it does exist.
Just can I reply to that, Terence?
Yep.
Just that does it run both ways? So if they can sue governments, can governments then sue them? You're creating the climate change, so you've been able to sue us, cool, we were good with it, but now we're suing you because of your role in climate change.
Yeah, and certain countries like Netherlands and so on, it has happened that companies have been brought to court. So that's certainly a very, in my mind, is a positive move.
Great, thank you. I think we've got about time for one more question. Sam, you've got up your hand. Would you like to ask a final question?
Yeah, thanks. By the way, very good overview. Thanks for all of that. And I just want to mention the difficult balance of, talking about doom and gloom, but still we can do something about it, right? One thing I want to understand a little bit better from you, if you don't mind, is the when we paint the government as being, needing to do more and such, and with your, overcoming obstacles around that and the political will, and I just feel like we need to sometimes move away from, them being the boogeyman sometimes. I think I work every day with people from both local and national government, and every single one of them is so passionate about the future and about finding ways to fix the climate change. All of them want to do so good. So I guess my question to you is, how can we move how can we transition the narrative to be, how can people, empower government or policymakers or people within local and national government to do the right things? And how can we help people that are in a difficult situation of making policies and having to implement them and want to do good? How can we help them? So instead of saying they're doing the wrong thing or don't want to do the wrong thing, how can we actually turn that around and say, how do we help them do the right thing? Because they want to do the right thing.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, this isn't a Pollyanna analysis. On the other hand, there are differences of view and factions within within government. We recognize that. I experienced it when I was a policy analyst. In fact, I found it difficult sometimes to keep up with all the dynamics going on behind the scenes, which I was supposed to know about but didn't understand, between various ministers. I suspected that things were there. Some I knew, some I didn't. I think what I was suggesting in pointing out, as we've noted in some of the research around the idea of those transpartisan coalitions, I tried to not say very much about that, and I don't think we say much in the report about it, because we're really talking about an off-stage, behind the scenes sort of networking and dynamic among those across various sectors that might be of similar mind toward a common goal, but recognizing the reality that there will be those who need to be convinced, and therefore that coalition of like-minded people talking, collaborating, gathering information, research, convincing would help build coherence. I think that might be the way, and I agree with you that simply it's kind of the notion that all of the government is just dragging its heels and behind because it hasn't worked miracles is not going to get us very far. I think it's a more subtle analysis of where some climate activists, for example, community groups might engage in that sort of thing. Others will be risky, or will see the risk in doing that, and will prefer to be outside and continue to be critics of government policy. So I guess that would be the thing where I would point, the strategy I would point to that might speak to what you're talking about as sort of deconstructing that notion that the government is the bogeyman and holding up everything.
No, thanks. That's very good. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you so much, Terence, for those great answers. I see many more great questions, but we're a little bit pushed for time. So thank you to all who have engaged or been so engaged. Thank you. All right, as I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of this webinar, this is not only the launch for the report of the Fossil Fuels Aotearoa Research Network, led by Dr. Terence Loomis, but we're also using this opportunity to share with you and launch our new 350 Aotearoa homegrown energy campaign. And I saw a few questions around what can the public do, what can we do about this? And I hope that this campaign will be an opportunity for that some of you will feel like, yes, this is the way we can go about it, or at least one way. Now, as many of you will be aware, and that's probably been the reason that you've showed up tonight, New Zealand needs a substantial increase in new build renewable generation to replace coal and gas energy and to support the growing electrification of transport and industrial processes. Of the options on the table, and one that Dr. Terence Loomis has mentioned as well, are community-owned renewable energy projects, because they are the most socially progressive way of increasing clean energy in New Zealand. And unfortunately, this hasn't been one of the options the New Zealand government has looked into too seriously yet. Currently, they have invested 11.4 million of our taxpayer money to explore the feasibility of Lake Onslow for a giant battery project that is set to get us through the dry years. Not to mention the severe conservation concerns our allies at Forest and Bird have expressed with regards to this project. We also believe that the government is failing to address a huge injustice present in our current energy system that we haven't touched on too much tonight by continuing to consider centralized alternatives. So we believe it is time to advocate and demand for real solutions. As we learned from Dr. Loomis' presentation, we need climate justice advocacy groups like ours to make noise and build the public pressure to let our government know that we can't keep powering our lives with polluting fuels from the last century that keep damaging our climate, our neighbourhoods, and our healths. The fossil fuel industry is greedily lining its pockets, and 5 major power companies in New Zealand profit from burning coal. Meanwhile, our communities suffer from stronger floods, droughts, polluted air, blackouts, and soaring energy bills. And the government's own recent inquiry into electricity prices paints a picture of energy injustice. In the last 30 years, households have seen their power prices rise by 79%, while commercial rates have dropped by 24%. New Zealand's most vulnerable households have been disproportionately affected through additional penalties, such as missing out on prompt payment discounts, which can be as high as 26% of the bill. And furthermore to that, the Auckland University has found that energy generators have taken home 5.4 billion in excess profits in the last 7 years. The centralized, privatized, deregulated energy system that we have today is a failed experiment of neoliberalism, which is delivering neither emission reductions nor affordability, and neither efficiency nor innovation. Clean energy growth has been stymied while power prices have skyrocketed for the most vulnerable. And there's a direct link between the high power prices and the use of dirty energy like coal, gas, and diesel to meet peaks in demand. So for too long, the rules that govern our energy system have prioritized energy company profits over a safe climate, local ownership, and affordable household bills. So what we need is bold political intervention to correct the injustice in our energy system and address energy poverty and ongoing fossil fuel use. So what we can do together is to draw a line in the sand and speak up against our broken energy system, because we have the opportunity to push our politicians to invest in affordable clean energy and introduce policies that will strengthen energy sovereignty. So I ask everyone on the call tonight and watching the recording, will you join our fight for climate justice and start advocating for solutions? We have the technology available to power our lives without killing our planet or harming our communities. Getting to 100% renewable energy, electricity, is 100% doable. And we can have homegrown and locally produced energy and stop being reliant on the fossil fuel industry. So I hope to see all of you again and join our fight for energy justice in Aotearoa. I want to just express a huge thanks to Dr. Terence Loomis again for offering to present at tonight's webinar. We are so grateful to your contributions to our movement. Ngā mihi to my wonderful colleagues Alana and Crystal, who've helped with the preparation of tonight's webinar, and ngā mihi to our 350 Aotearoa donors, supporters and volunteers who I know are present here tonight, who have enabled us to do this work. Ngā mihi ki a koutou for taking this hour out of your busy lives to join our webinar tonight. Ka kite anō.
Kia ora.